What is this strange Gothic looking structure that is situated outside the district of Bradford, and its connection with these beautiful stained glass windows from a Bradford church? Most importantly, what are their origins and its connection to City Park? And we ask the old age question, what happened to the bodies and graves from that area? Stay with us until the end as Markham covers a fascinating story and discovery.
Hello and welcome to the centre of Bradford. Behind me is City Park, which has been here since 2012. And it's an area of Bradford that's changed many times over the years. And I often think to myself, when people are walking through City Park, are they aware of certain facts? Like, do they know that once upon a time there was graves down there? Do they know that apart from City Hall, there used to be some very stunning architecture? Well, if those people weren't aware of those things, and if you're a regular viewer that's interested in graves and beautiful architecture, stay tuned. You might enjoy this one. Many years ago, the streetscape behind what is now City Hall was very different to what it is today. There was a lane which stretched from what is now Bridge Street. It came towards the rear of the then Town Hall prior to its extension at an angle. And that lane was called Toad Lane. There is speculation that the correct pronunciation of Toad Lane is actually Toad Lane, as in the old lane. But Toad Lane later became known as Chapel Lane. And Chapel Lane is the focus of today's video, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail now for you. Chapel Lane is all but gone now, but there is actually a very small section of it still in situation, and it's in the courtyard between the original Town Hall building and its later extension. But Chapel Lane ran along the back of the Town Hall all the way across to the bottom of Manchester Road. Behind me is the Bradford Magistrate Court, and before I go on, I would like to say that in my opinion this is one example of Bradford architects and planners getting something right in the 1970s. I think it's a nice building actually, and it does complement the City Hall quite well. But where I'm stood now, I'm stood on a spot which was previously used for worship in Bradford. In 1719, a chapel was constructed here using materials from Howley Hall near Batley, which had been demolished a couple of years before. Originally a Presbyterian meeting house, the chapel eventually became a place of worship for Bradford's Unitarian congregation. The congregation had been transferred from a former meeting house situated at Chapel Fold in 𝗥𝗲𝗄. Their new chapel grounds were bordered by a high wall and an imposing stone gateway. Regular subscribers might be interested to know that there was also a graveyard here. The first burial took place in August 1719, the deceased being Judith Ferrand. Some of the interments were beneath the chapel floor. However, the introduction of the Burial Act of 1852, which had been passed by Parliament, resulted in the use of the chapel grounds for burials being discontinued due to sanitary concerns. Undercliffe Cemtery became an early solution to this restriction. The final burial at Chapel Lane took place in May 1853 with the interment of 3-year-old Ellen Thrish. Her tombstone read, "Oh, cease to drop the pitying tear, I am gone beyond the reach of fear." After providing a place of worship for almost 150 years, it was decided in 1864 that the chapel should be replaced by new, larger premises. The final service took place on Sunday the 6th of October 1867. It took approximately 18 months for the new chapel to be built. It was going to be a larger building. And it was that big that it was actually constructed on the former burial ground. Some of the gravestones had to be moved to allow for the construction, but the graves themselves remained undisturbed. Designed by Andrew's son and Pepper, who had been inspired by 13th century French Gothic architecture, the new premises were certainly imposing with its height of 75 feet. The new chapel was to accommodate 500. Its first service took place on Thursday the 3rd of June 1869. A new Sunday school had also been constructed to the rear, which became known as Channing Hall. Today, many people recall giving blood there in the mid-20th century. The Unitarian Chapel served its congregation well into the 20th century, even celebrating both its bicentenary and jubilee in 1919, and so it continued for almost 100 years. When the centre of Bradford was being redeveloped during the 1960s, the site on which the Unitarian Chapel stood, that was earmarked for redevelopment by the council. They wanted to create a civic precinct with some law courts and a police station. So the chapel was subject to a compulsory purchase order. The final services at the Unitarian Chapel in the centre of Bradford took place on the 7th and 8th of June 1969. And those final services were memorable really for perhaps the wrong reasons. Because during that time, the Odeon cinema, which was behind the chapel, was in advanced states of demolition. And there had actually been a gas explosion, but as a result of that, several of the windows of the chapel had been broken during the blast. So those final services were conducted with broken windows and the noise of workmen outside coming through into the chapel. Exactly 100 years had passed since the first service had been delivered in the 1869 chapel. Dr. Alan Bullock, a master at St Catherine's College in Oxfordshire and the son of a former minister of the chapel, was the preacher at the final service that Sunday evening. The occasion also marked the 250th anniversary of a church first appearing on the site. Dr. Bullock expressed some frustration. He said, "When I came into this church this morning, I felt shocked at the damage caused by the explosion. This evening, I feel a certain anger and wonder why the authorities of this city allow the peace of this day and this service to be disturbed by the noise of people cutting girders." He also celebrated the congregation's sense of community spirit and their determination to ensure the final services would proceed as planned, as they had cleared away all of the debris caused by the previous night's explosion. And so the final moments of the Unitarian Chapel in the centre of Bradford occurred on the 21st of August 1969, when a huge wrecking ball smashed into the grand Gothic architecture of the building. Many locals today vividly recall the exhumation of the old graveyard during the demolition, which was said to have been supervised by council and coroner officials. Some people have spoken of a gruesome task that required the site being screened off, whilst others recall the upper windows of City Hall offering a ringside view of the grim proceedings below. More than 100 years had passed since the last burial, so it's unlikely that much would have been left of the dead in 1969. But there are two testimonies, and both suggest that the remains were possibly reinterred at 𝗥𝗲𝗺𝗏𝗏 Cemetery. But there's no reference to a reburial there in the burial records, or at any other cemetery, as far as we can see. So, what happened to the bodies?
The chapel relocated to a new church in the early 1970s. The congregation wasn't the only thing that had transferred there. The windows from the Gothic chapel were retained and installed in the new church.
So we're inside the chapel, and as you can see behind me, the windows. These repositioned windows are actually quite shorter than the windows that were in situ down on Chapel Lane. These windows were gifted to the second Gothic chapel in 1905 by the widow of Reverend George Vance Smith, a former minister. The monetary value of her gesture was a reported £2,000. They'd been manufactured by Heaton, Butler and Bain, the celebrated glassmakers. whose stained glass can still be seen in churches around the world. The fact that their colourful depiction of Christ in the temple had survived the gas explosion of 1969 when the other windows in the chapel didn't is a minor miracle in itself. But this is surely overshadowed by the revelation that Bradford is an unassuming location for seemingly long-forgotten examples of work produced by world-renowned glassmakers nearly 120 years ago. Wow. These figures were originally housed inside windows of the 1869 chapel.
Here we have a stone tablet that had also been affixed to the Gothic chapel's wall. We have now arrived in Rawdon, and a further discovery of Bradford's past is about to be revealed.
Following the demolition of the first Unitarian Chapel, some elements of the building, I'm talking more specifically about its gateway, was brought here to Rawdon and positioned in the garden of a Mr. Arthur Briggs. What a thrill it is, a rare treat to be able to walk through a section of old Bradford. And it's amazing to think that things like this still exist and pieces of old Bradford can turn up virtually anywhere.